The Riverside gated community had exactly 147 residential units, a championship 18-hole golf course, 3 swimming pools, and one woman who believed the rules were suggestions for other people. Her name was Diane Thornton, and she had never paid initiation fees in her life. Sarah Chen stood at her kitchen window, a cooling cup of coffee forgotten in her hand, watching the familiar scene unfold for the 7th consecutive Friday. The silver Range Rover swept through the automatic gate, always behind another car, never using her own gate card. The vehicle circled the parking lot near the Olympic-sized pool, eventually claiming a spot in the resident-only parking section despite bearing an out-of-state license plate. From her vantage point 3 stories up in Tower 7, Sarah could see everything. She'd selected this penthouse unit specifically for that view, the forest green hills to the west, the valley spreading out below, and crucially, the pool complex where she'd invested $60,000 in initiation fees, $285,000 in the actual residence, and another $1,200 monthly in HOA dues. Rules weren't abstract to Sarah. Rules were the currency of order in a community like this. Rules were what kept it exclusive. Rules were what she'd paid for. The car door opened. Diane Thornton stepped out first, a woman in her late 40s with the kind of effortless fitness that screamed private trainers and expensive yoga studios. Behind her came 3 children who may or may not have been hers, followed by a man in designer casual where that cost more than Sarah's monthly car payment. They didn't have towels. Sarah set down her coffee mug with deliberate care and opened her laptop. The thing about Diane Thornton was that she'd never intended to be dishonest. At least that's what she would have told anyone who asked. What had happened was this. Her sister Andrea had moved into Riverside Estates 18 months ago, and Diane had begun taking the kids to the pool on Friday afternoons because it was safer than the municipal pool, cleaner than the community centers, and, most importantly, free. Free in the way that theft is free. Free in the way that parking in someone else's spot is free. Free in the way that borrowing someone's Netflix password is free. Diane had rationalized it meticulously. She drove through the gate because she was visiting her sister. That was technically true, even if her sister's apartment was in the opposite tower. She parked in the resident spots because they were consistently more available than the guest spots, and she didn't want to inconvenience actual guests. She took the kids to the pool because fresh water and sunshine were childhood staples, rights almost, and her ex-husband had cut her child support by 30% last year. She had created a justification infrastructure so elaborate that she'd genuinely begun to believe it. The way Diane saw it, she wasn't stealing from the HOA. The HOA was a faceless organization, essentially a corporation, and everyone knew corporations were designed to be outsmarted by individuals. What Diane didn't know was that Sarah Chen had been tracking her movements for 3 weeks. Sarah's spreadsheet was a work of art. It documented every visit, dates, times, duration, which children were present, what the man wearing designer clothes was wearing on each occasion. She'd photographed the license plate from multiple angles, cross-referenced it through a digital records service, and discovered that the Range Rover was registered to a Diane Thornton in Sacramento, approximately 90 minutes north. The HOA bylaws, which Sarah had read 3 times, highlighted, and filed in a color-coded binder, specifically outlined that non-residents were permitted access to community facilities only when accompanied by a resident and during the day, 5 a.m. to 10 p.m. Overnight guests required advance notification. Extended family visits exceeding 2 consecutive days required written approval from the HOA board. Diane Thornton appeared to be abusing the guest privilege on a weekly basis. But here's what pushed Sarah from annoyance to action. 2 weeks ago, the HOA had denied her request for a minor modification to her shared courtyard space. She'd wanted to add a small fountain, purely decorative, no recirculating mechanism that would increase water usage, and the board had rejected it. Too precedent-setting, they'd said, establishes an expectation for individualization, they'd written. Meanwhile, Diane Thornton had been using thousands of dollars in amenities without paying a cent. Sarah picked up her phone and dialed the HOA office. "Yes, I'd like to report a violation of the community guidelines," she said, her voice smooth and professional. "It concerns unauthorized guest access to our facilities and potential misuse of resident parking. I have comprehensive documentation including photographs and dates." The person on the other end, A woman named Patricia, who'd been managing this HOA for 6 years, sat up straighter. Patricia dealt with noise complaints and landscaping disputes. Genuine violations, documented and presented professionally, were rare. "I'll need you to file a formal complaint," Patricia said. "That requires the online portal. Have you been to the community website?" "I have," Sarah said, "but I wanted to give you a heads up first as a courtesy." Patricia should have stuck to procedure. She should have directed Sarah to the portal and let the proper channels handle it. Instead, she said something that would echo through the next 6 weeks. "You know what? Send me the documentation. I'll take a look personally. This kind of thing really undermines the integrity of the community." Integrity of the community. Those words settled into Sarah's chest like a key turning in a lock. By the following Friday, Diane had turned into a problem with a face and a name, and a rising number of incidents logged in the HOA database. When she pulled through the gate at 2:47 p.m. on that 8th visit, something had changed. She didn't notice it at first. The gate opened as smoothly as always. The security guard waved her through with the distraction of someone who'd been doing this job for 4 years and had long stopped actually looking at people. She found a parking spot in her usual location, a shaded area near the pool complex entrance that she'd claimed as her own through the simple act of consistent occupation. It was Marcus, the guard, who first realized something was different. He glanced at his phone, which had buzzed with a notification from the HOA security management system. A flag had been placed on a particular license plate. Guest vehicle access. Verify resident connection before allowing entry. Marcus squinted at his screen. Then he looked back at the road where Diane's car had already passed the checkpoint. He considered radioing it in. Instead, he decided to observe. Diane felt the shift in the air before she consciously understood it. She was directing the children, her own 2 kids and Andrea's daughter, toward the pool entrance when she noticed that the usually indifferent staff member at the gate was watching her more carefully than before. Not aggressively, just attentively. "Come on," she said to the kids, moving faster. "Let's get into the water." The pool was extraordinary. Olympic-sized, heated, with separate diving boards, lap lanes, and a shallow recreational area for children. The surrounding deck was Italian stone, heated in winter by underground systems that cost more annually to maintain than Diane's monthly mortgage payment. Beyond the pool, you could see out over the entire valley, and the afternoon sun painted everything gold. The kids whooped with delight and thundered toward the changing rooms. Diane found herself a lounger, a resident-quality lounger worth about $800 retail, provided free to members, and settled in with a magazine. She told herself she didn't feel the weight of anything. She told herself this was fine. This was normal. At 4:15 p.m., a man in a polo shirt approached her. He had the kind of professional kindness that made Diane's stomach drop before he'd even spoken. "Ms. Thornton," he said, "I'm Greg Patterson, HOA Security Coordinator. I need to verify your resident status." Diane sat up slowly. Around them, other pool-goers had begun to notice. Some of them were people she recognized from previous visits, people who'd nodded at her, who'd suggested which time slots were best for avoiding crowds. "I'm visiting my sister," Diane said, still in that smooth, untroubled voice she'd perfected. "Andrea Thornton, Tower 2, Unit 408. Greg was already typing on his tablet. His expression didn't change, but something in the set of his shoulders told Diane that he'd already known the answer before asking the question. "I've verified that," he said. "What I need to verify is whether you've notified the HOA of the frequency of your visits. Our bylaws state that guests staying more than 12 cumulative days in any 30-day period must be declared and approved." Diane's mouth went dry. She could see the children in the distance, still in the water, still laughing. "I wasn't staying," Diane said. "I was just visiting during the day." "For the past 8 Fridays," Greg said quietly. 4 to 5 hours each time. That's 30-plus hours in 30 days, which exceeds community guidelines for casual guest visitation." He said it without anger or judgment. He said it like he was reading a medical test result to a patient. Factual, irrefutable. "I wasn't aware," Diane said, and it was almost true. She hadn't allowed herself to be aware. "I need to ask you to remove the children from the pool and leave the facility," Greg said. "I'll be documenting this incident. If it continues without prior HOA approval, We may need to involve our legal counsel regarding unauthorized facility access. The sun seemed suddenly very bright. Diane gathered the children with murmured explanations about unexpected schedules and early dinners. They were confused and disappointed in the way kids are when the good thing ends too soon. She loaded them into her car and didn't drive directly home. Instead, she found herself on an overlook point above the valley, watching the sun begin its descent while her hands shook against the steering wheel. This was when she should have recognized the warning. This was the moment when she should have paid the initiation fees, applied for official guest passes, or simply stopped coming. Instead, Diane made the decision that would cost her considerably more than the $60,000 she'd been avoiding. "They can't ban me from seeing my sister," she told herself. "I haven't done anything that wrong." Meanwhile, Sarah received a notification from Patricia at the HOA office. "Your complaint has been documented. Security is now monitoring the violation. Thank you for your vigilance in maintaining our community standards." Sarah felt something bloom in her chest. It wasn't quite satisfaction. It was something sharper, something that resembled justice but had edges that could cut. She poured herself a glass of wine and opened her laptop. She had more documentation to prepare, because she'd been thorough enough to notice something else. Diane Thornton's car had been parked overnight, 3 times, in the resident-only parking section where overnight parking was restricted to current residents. Sarah had photographs with timestamps. She had time to make this absolutely bulletproof. The second visit to the pool happened 5 days later, which was either brave or stupid, probably both. Diane told herself she wasn't going to let one awkward encounter define her summer. She told herself that what she was doing was harmless, victimless, and that the HOA security coordinator had been doing his job, but that his job didn't have to determine what she did with her free time. She told herself that her children deserved to swim in a beautiful pool, and that the only person stopping her was a faceless corporation designed by wealthy people to exclude less wealthy people. All of these things were technically true, which made them all equally irrelevant. She pulled through the gate on the following Wednesday at 2:15 p.m., taking a different route to the pool to avoid the security checkpoint. She had a new strategy: arrive earlier, stay less conspicuously, leave before the evening shift came on. Blend in, be forgotten. What she didn't know was that Greg Patterson had flagged her license plate in the security system permanently. Every entry was now logged. Every timestamp created a digital breadcrumb trail. Sarah Chen, meanwhile, had been working. She'd filed 3 formal complaints through the HOA portal. Each one was meticulous, photographs attached, dates listed, specific bylaws cited. She'd focused on the overnight parking violations, which had consequences that went beyond just pool access. Overnight parking in resident-only spaces was actually a violation that could result in towing. Sarah had made a list of every night the Range Rover had appeared in the lot after 11 p.m. She had satellite images from Google Maps showing it was definitely there. She had security footage stills that Patricia had provided. Because yes, Patricia had been helpful, because Patricia liked order and rules and the feeling of holding authority. On Wednesday afternoon, while Diane was in the water, Greg Patterson received a new instruction from the HOA board. If the same vehicle appeared again in violation of the parking ordinances, he was authorized to have it towed. He didn't know about Sarah's documentation campaign. He didn't know that an entire infrastructure was being constructed around the simple fact of Diane's car sitting in the wrong place. He only knew what his job description said. Diane was underwater doing a lap when her phone buzzed in her bag on the lounger. She ignored it. The phone buzzed again, and again. By the time she surfaced, something in her understood that the normal world had shifted. She climbed out of the pool and checked the messages. "Andrea, is everything okay? Are you on your way home?" "Andrea, Diane, I'm worried. Can you call me?" "Andrea, the HOA called me. About you, about parking." Diane's wet feet left prints on the warm stone as she walked quickly to a quieter corner of the pool deck. She called her sister. "What happened?" she asked. Andrea's voice was shaky. "They called me this afternoon, said that your car has been parked in resident-only overnight spaces. They have dates and times. They said if it happens again, they'll tow it. But Diane, that's not even the main thing." "What's the main thing?" "They have a complaint filed. About you. Multiple complaints. About you using the facilities without proper guest approval. They're asking me for documentation that I've been hosting you and—" Andrea's voice cracked. "Who's doing this? Who would complain about us?" Diane couldn't answer because she didn't know. She knew the security coordinator. She knew the feeling of being watched. She didn't know the face of the person who decided to weaponize those feelings. "I need to talk to them," Diane said. "I need to explain." "You need to stop," Andrea said. "Diane, this is serious. They're talking about possible legal action. They keep saying unauthorized use of community property and repeated violation of guest policies. I'm listed as your sponsor, so I'm liable. My unit, my HOA standing." The realization hit Diane like a wave. She hadn't just broken the rules. She'd used her sister as a shield without asking. Andrea's membership, Andrea's standing in this place she'd chosen to call home, was now being questioned because of Diane's choices. "I'm sorry," Diane whispered. "I know," Andrea said, "but I need you to stop coming here. Tonight, I need you to stop." Sarah knew nothing about the phone call between the sisters, but she could see the Range Rover from her window, still parked in the lot, and she could see that Diane was emerging from the pool area. Sarah could see the moment the other woman's demeanor changed. Something about her posture had shifted. She was moving faster. She looked like someone who'd just received bad news. Sarah should have felt something like guilt. Some people, confronted with visible evidence of another person's distress, experience a recalibration of their actions. Sarah instead felt justified. If Diane Thornton had just paid her dues, none of this would be happening. If she'd simply followed the rules like everyone else, this entire situation could have been prevented. Sarah wasn't doing anything wrong. Sarah was maintaining standards. Sarah was defending the value of her investment. Sarah watched Diane leave the pool area, towel the children dry with movements that were suddenly all sharp angles and efficiency, and heard them back to the car. The Range Rover was gone by 4:47 p.m. Greg Patterson, doing his evening rounds, noted the departure in the security log. The vehicle was no longer present. No towing had been necessary. The situation, from an operational standpoint, had resolved itself. He didn't know it yet, but he just witnessed the exact moment when Diane's strategic retreat turned into a problem she couldn't see coming. The parking lot cameras, the ones that covered the full lot, including the visitor parking area, had been upgraded 6 months ago to include night vision capabilities. This was a decision made by the HOA board to cut down on vandalism. It had cost about $14,000 total. What it captured on Thursday night was this. The Range Rover reappeared at 11:23 p.m., parked in the exact same resident-only spot it had occupied before. Sarah, who couldn't have known this but somehow unsurprised by it, was awake and checking the HOA security portal. She'd been given access as part of her concerned resident status when the timestamp appeared. She took a screenshot, then another. Then she opened her email and composed a new message to Patricia. The unauthorized vehicle has returned to the resident-only lot at 11:23 p.m. on Thursday night. This represents a direct violation of the documented warning issued on Wednesday. Per HOA Bylaws Section 4.2, vehicles in violation of parking ordinances are subject to removal at the owner's expense. Then she added, "I'm copying the entire HOA board on this, as I believe this level of repeated violation warrants formal action." Sarah hit send at 11:47 p.m. By 2:15 a.m., an automated text had been sent to a towing company. Vehicle identified in lot. Resident parking violation. Approval for removal granted. Lot A7. By 3:30 a.m., the silver Range Rover was being towed to a lot 5 miles away, where Diane would later discover that retrieving it would cost her $385 in towing fees, plus an additional $125 per day in storage fees. By 4:00 a.m., the towing company had sent its completion notification to the HOA security system. By 6:00 a.m., when Diane received a call from an unknown number informing her that her vehicle had been towed for unauthorized parking, she was sitting in her apartment in Sacramento, about to start another day at the paralegal firm where she worked 60 hours a week for a salary that meant the difference between her kids taking piano lessons and them not. The paralegal understood procedures. She understood the precise application of rules and consequences. She understood exactly how powerless she actually was in a system designed by people wealthier and more connected than her. "Where is my car?" she asked the towing company representative. "We have the information right here," the man said. "Glenwood Automotive Recovery, half a mile off I-80. You can pick it up during business hours tomorrow. You'll need to bring your ID and a valid credit card. $510 minimum. $510 that wasn't in her budget. $510 that would mean cutting back on grocery spending, or postponing a dental appointment, or asking her ex-husband for something, anything, which she'd rather set her hair on fire than do. Diane did what the script demanded. She called the HOA office as soon as it opened. "My car was towed last night," she said. "I need to understand the authorization for that. I believe there's been a mistake." Patricia, sitting at her desk with her coffee, had been anticipating this call. "There was no mistake," Patricia said. "Your vehicle was identified in resident-only parking in violation of community ordinances. A formal complaint was filed documenting repeated violations. After a warning was issued on Wednesday, the vehicle returned to the same violation. Towing was authorized per our bylaws." "I was visiting my sister," Diane said. "I'm allowed to visit my sister." "You're allowed to visit," Patricia agreed. "You're not allowed to park overnight in restricted areas. That's very clear in the governing documents." Diane felt something hot and sharp build behind her eyes. "I had no idea." "You were informed Wednesday," Patricia interrupted. "By our security coordinator, personally. He documented your visit and explained the violation. This was a second offense." There was a quality to Patricia's voice that hadn't been there before. She sounded like someone who'd been waiting for an excuse to enforce something. Diane realized, too late, that she'd become a case, a file, a problem that Patricia now had the legal authority to solve. "What do I need to do?" Diane asked. "Pay the towing and storage fees," Patricia said. "Retrieve your vehicle, and I'd recommend you do not return to this community until you've completed the HOA guest approval process. If you wish to visit frequently, your sister would need to formally add you to her authorized guest list. Otherwise, we can only permit visits of no more than 7 consecutive days every 30 days. That's the community standard." Diane did the math in her head. 7 days in 30. Andrea had been allowing her to come every Friday. That was only 4 days a month, 4 days that had been illegal and 4 days that now had a price attached. "I understand," Diane said. She retrieved her car at 4:30 p.m. on Thursday, paid $510 to people who didn't care about her circumstances, and drove home in silence, her children asking questions about where the car had been, what had happened, why Mommy was upset. By 8 p.m. that night, she'd filled out the guest authorization form. By 9 p.m., she'd submitted it to the HOA for review. By 10 p.m., she'd sent Andrea a message. "I'm so sorry. I've submitted the guest approval request. I'll only visit on approved days." Andrea's response came at 11:15 p.m. "I got a call from Patricia. She says the approval is pending board review. It could take a month. She said you made a scene at the towing company. Diane, what is going on?" Diane hadn't made a scene. She'd cried quietly in her car, which was different. But she realized something in that moment. There was someone on the other side of this, someone who decided that Diane needed to be punished, someone who was feeding information to the HOA, someone who was probably checking the security portal daily to see if the Range Rover had returned. Someone with a name she didn't know and a motive she didn't understand. Someone who had decided that Diane Thornton deserved consequence. She was a paralegal, which meant she understood how to investigate, how to trace chains of causation, how to follow the thread of human motivation back to its source. Someone had filed multiple complaints. Someone had documented her parking. Someone had known exactly when to escalate things, which meant someone was watching her specifically. The pool at Riverside Estates had a peak attendance of about 60 residents per day. Most of them came on weekends. The people who came on Friday afternoons at 2:47 p.m. were a smaller subset. Diane had recognized faces over her 8 visits. She could probably identify at least 4 or 5 people who'd been there regularly. One of them had decided to make her life difficult. Diane pulled a legal pad from her home office and began making a list, not of suspects, of observations. She noted times, people, possible angles. She thought about who would have the level of technical access to file complaints and receive security notifications. She thought about who would care enough to invest that kind of attention. Her sister wouldn't do this. Andrea had been flustered and worried, not triumphant. This wasn't Andrea's style. Someone in the community, then. Someone with investment in the rules. Someone who had probably noticed the Range Rover and decided it represented a threat to the proper order of things. Diane made a second list. People who cared enough about HOA rules to actually file formal complaints about them. That narrowed things considerably. Most residents treated the HOA bylaws the way they treated other people's property lines, as something other people needed to respect, not something that applied to them. But there was definitely a subset. The subset that invested time in community governance. The subset that probably attended HOA board meetings. Diane's ex-husband was a tech bro who'd gotten moderately wealthy by being in the right place when AI prediction models became valuable. He hadn't been a good husband, but he had been useful for maintaining access to certain databases. When Diane called him Thursday evening, she did something she'd avoided for 3 years. She asked him for a favor. "I need a list of licensed investigators who work in the Sacramento area," she said. "Specifically people who do research on residential communities." "Why?" he asked, in that way that suggested he already suspected she was being litigious again. After the divorce, she'd threatened legal action multiple times. He'd learned to preempt. "It's not about you," she said. "I promise it's about something else." He sent her 3 names within an hour. Diane hired the cheapest one, a woman named Rosa who worked from her home office and charged $60 an hour with a 10-hour minimum. "I need to know who filed complaints against me in an HOA community," Diane explained over the phone. "I need to know who has access to the security portals. I need to know, basically, who's been paying attention to me." Rosa was quiet for a moment. "That's going to be tricky," she said. "HOA complaints are technically filed by members, so they're not exactly private, but the HOA isn't usually forthcoming about who said what. You'd need to either get someone inside to tell you, or you'd need to file a public records request." "Can you do a public records request?" "Technically you can do it," Rosa said. "On your own, costs nothing, might take a few weeks, but it's legal. They have to provide you with documented complaints filed about your property or vehicle. That would include names." Diane paid the 10-hour minimum and asked Rosa to start the process. Then she did something more direct. She called the HOA office and asked for the documentation on her complaints. Patricia said no. "Those are filed by concerned residents," Patricia said. "Releasing the names of complainants would violate their privacy." "It's public record," Diane said. "I have the right to know who filed complaints against me." "You have the right to know that there are complaints," Patricia said. "The process is to request them formally through the county clerk's office. That takes time. In the interim, what I can tell you is that the complaints are legitimate, documented, and factually accurate. Whether you know who filed them doesn't change their validity." Diane hung up and started the formal public records request process. While waiting for that to process, Diane did something that probably should have felt petty but instead felt focused. She started attending HOA board meetings. Riverside Estates held monthly meetings in the community center on the second Tuesday of each month. The next one was in 4 days. Diane submitted her name to speak on the agenda. She dressed carefully that morning, business casual, professional, but not aggressively so. She wanted to be the kind of person you'd underestimate. She wanted to be the kind of person an HOA board would dismiss as a non-resident making noise. What she wanted most was to watch people's faces when she spoke. The meeting room held about 80 chairs, arranged in a semicircle facing a long table where 5 board members sat. There was Patricia from the HOA office, along with 4 residents who'd been elected to the board in the way that most HOA board members get elected. No one else had wanted the job badly enough to run. Diane sat in the back and observed. The meeting covered routine business. A neighbor complained about landscaping in Tower 3. Someone asked about the tennis court renovation schedule. There was a brief discussion about whether the golf course should implement a new watering system to save water in drought years. Then Diane's name was called. She walked to the microphone. Yes, they had a microphone, and stood before the board with her legal pad in her hands. "Hi," she said. "I'm Diane Thornton. I'm the sister of Andrea Thornton, who lives in Tower 2. I'm here regarding the complaints that have been filed against me regarding pool access and parking violations. She could see something shift in Patricia's posture. Patricia had not expected Diane to show up. Patricia had not expected Diane to fight. I'd like to request formally that whoever filed these complaints be present so we can discuss this issue, Diane said. I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I'd like the opportunity to address it directly with the person who feels that I've violated community standards. The board members exchanged glances. This wasn't how these things usually went. Usually, someone received a notice, apologized, and the matter was closed. Ms. Thornton, one of the board members said, his name was Robert and he managed a real estate portfolio for a living. That's not how our process works. Formal complaints are filed and reviewed by the board. We're not a court system. I understand, Diane said, but I also think that an accusation deserves a face. I think if someone believes I've violated community rules, I have the right to hear that directly. Otherwise, I'm being accused in the dark. She said it calmly, professionally, the way she'd been trained to speak in depositions. She said it in a way that made several other residents nod slightly. We'll take your concern under advisement, Robert said. Is there anything else? Yes, Diane said. I'd like to request an emergency review of my guest approval application. I've submitted the paperwork to visit my sister according to all HOA standards. I'd like that reviewed and approved. That will take the normal time frame, Patricia said. The normal time frame involves some level of expedited review when there are outstanding complaints, Diane said. I'd like the board to vote on expedited review. She'd trapped them slightly, and she could see that they knew it. To vote against expedited review looked like punishment. To vote for it created a precedent. Robert sighed. We'll vote on expedited review at the end of the meeting. Is there anything else? No, Diane said. Thank you. She walked back to her seat and sat down. The board voted to expedite her application. Patricia's jaw was tight enough to crack. After the meeting, Diane stood in the community center parking lot, waiting. She didn't have to wait long. A woman approached her, mid-50s, clearly fit, with the kind of posture that suggested someone used to being obeyed. That was quite a performance, the woman said. Diane turned to face her. This woman had a look about her, something precise, something controlled, something that suggested a level of engagement with rules that went beyond normal. I'm sorry, Diane said. The way you presented yourself, the woman continued. Like you were the victim, like you were the one who'd been wronged. Diane felt something click into place. This woman's tone, this woman's attention, it had the particular flavor of someone nursing a grievance. Did you file a complaint against me? Diane asked. The woman's expression flickered. She'd meant to intimidate, and instead she'd revealed something. My name is Sarah Chen, the woman said. I live in Tower 7. I filed formal documentation regarding your repeated violations of community guidelines. Diane's hands were shaking slightly, but she kept her voice steady. Why? Because, Sarah said, some of us pay for the privilege of living here. Some of us follow the rules. Some of us don't get to just decide that rules don't apply. I visited my sister, Diane said. I used a swimming pool. I parked my car. You used thousands of dollars in community amenities without paying a penny for them, Sarah said. You parked in resident-only spots. You treated this community like you owned it. I asked for permission after the first warning, Diane said. I submitted the guest application. After you were caught, Sarah corrected. After you'd already invaded this space. After you'd already decided that your recreation was worth more than community standards. Diane felt anger rise in her chest, genuine hot anger. You had my car towed. I reported a violation, Sarah said. The HOA made the decision about towing. You filled their heads with complaints, Diane said. You gave them permission to target me. I documented violations, Sarah said. If that resulted in consequences, those consequences were deserved. They stood in the parking lot in the light of the late afternoon sun. Two women whose lives had collided over the simple fact that one had rules, and the other had decided those rules weren't meant for her. Why? Diane asked again, and this time it was a different question. This time she was asking, why me? Why escalate? Why not just accept that people break rules? Sarah's answer came very quietly. Because if people like you get to ignore rules, then what was the point of me following them? What was the point of me paying? Then Sarah turned and walked toward Tower 7, leaving Diane in the parking lot with the understanding that this wasn't about justice or community standards or the integrity of HOA guidelines. This was about Sarah's choice to make Diane pay for something Sarah herself couldn't control. The revelation changed everything. Before, Diane had been dealing with an abstract system. Now she was dealing with a person who'd felt threatened by her presence, a person who decided that Diane's freedom to enjoy a pool without paying for it was an assault on Sarah's invested sense of order. Diane understood, for the first time, that Sarah wasn't going to stop, that this had become something else, something personal, something that only ended when one of them surrendered or when one of them found a way to make the other person understand what it felt like to have your life controlled by someone else's rules. She had a name now, she had a face, she had an opponent. And Diane was only getting started. Public records requests are beautiful in their simplicity. They're also devastating in their power because they operate on a foundation of legal obligation. The county clerk's office received Diane's request on a Tuesday and began processing it according to procedure. A notice was sent to the HOA office. The HOA office was required to provide copies of complaints filed against her property. It took 11 days. Diane received the file at her Sacramento apartment on a Wednesday morning. It was a single piece of paper, stamped and certified, and it contained the name: Sarah Chen, Tower 7, Unit 304. With Sarah Chen's formal name attached to formal complaints, certain other things became possible. What Diane did next operated in the gray space between clever and vindictive. It was the kind of thing a paralegal thinks about but doesn't usually do, because doing it crosses a line from defense into offense. Diane hired Rosa again. This time she asked for something specific: a full background check on Sarah Chen, property records, financial information, anything that might be available through legitimate public sources. "This is thorough, which means expensive," Rosa warned. "We're looking at maybe $2,000. "Do it," Diane said. Sarah Chen had purchased her penthouse at Riverside Estates 3 years ago for $285,000. She'd paid cash, which meant either significant savings or investment income. Diane found records of her down payment in real estate databases. She found that Sarah worked for a consulting firm that specialized in business process optimization. She found that Sarah had been disciplined once, 5 years ago, at her workplace for aggressive enforcement of process standards, an HR euphemism for behavior that had been deemed problematic by colleagues. Rosa delivered all of this as a neat report with attachments and sourcing. "What are you going to do with this?" Rosa asked carefully. "Nothing illegal," Diane said. She was technically correct. What Diane did instead was brilliantly lateral. She went back to the HOA office and requested a copy of her guest approval application. When Patricia tried to dodge the request, Diane cited HOA protocol that required copies be provided within 5 business days at no charge. She received the copy 3 days later. Then she requested all documentation related to the complaints against her, not the complaints themselves, but the specific processes used to file them, any communications associated with them, anything that showed how the complaint system operated. Patricia began to realize that Diane understood the infrastructure better than most residents. Patricia began to suspect that Diane had legal counsel, which she didn't. She had something more dangerous. She had professional knowledge and nothing left to lose. By the end of that week, Diane had accumulated enough documentation to see something that made her slow down and think carefully. Sarah had filed 3 separate formal complaints, but more importantly, Sarah had been copied on communications with the HOA security personnel that suggested Sarah had direct access to security portals. Sarah had been shown security footage. Sarah had been given information that was typically privileged. This suggested a level of access that wasn't standard for residents. Diane called Patricia, not at the HOA office, but on her personal cell phone, a number Rosa had provided, legally obtained from employment databases. "What I'm about to tell you stays between us," Diane said. "I'm not being threatening. I'm being informative. I've reviewed the documentation related to the complaints against me. I've noticed that one specific resident, Sarah Chen, appears to have received more detailed security information than is typically provided to other residents. I've also noticed that this same resident appears to have influenced the decision to tow my vehicle, possibly beyond her formal complaints. Patricia was quiet. What I'm suggesting, Diane continued, is that there may be a question about whether HOA resources and security access were used inappropriately to target a specific individual. That's something that could potentially be concerning if, say, someone else in this community decided to file a formal complaint about it. It was not blackmail. It was not a threat. It was simple causation being spelled out clearly. If you continue to let this happen, I will escalate this through proper channels. Patricia, who'd been in the property management business for 18 years and had seen enough disputes to know which ones could metastasize into litigation, understood this immediately. I'll review the access logs, Patricia said quietly. If there's been any inappropriate resource sharing, we'll address it. What Patricia found when she actually reviewed those access logs was immediately concerning. Sarah Chen had logged into the HOA security portal 47 times over the past month. She'd accessed it most frequently on days when Diane's vehicle was in the lot. She'd viewed the same parking spot footage multiple times from multiple angles. She'd requested and received detailed documentation of enforcement procedures that should have been kept within the HOA office. This wasn't the behavior of a concerned resident. This was the behavior of someone obsessing. Patricia scheduled a meeting with the HOA board and presented her findings. She didn't use the word obsessive. She used the word concerning. She noted that the level of access wasn't standard. She suggested that Sarah Chen's complaints, while technically valid, might have been motivated by something other than community concern. The board discussed it for approximately 40 minutes. Then Robert made a decision that Patricia had anticipated. They would conduct a review of their communication procedures with residents and would limit security access going forward. More importantly, they voted to uphold Diane's guest approval application without restriction. Andrea could list Diane as an approved frequent guest. Diane could visit the pool as a guest of her sister. The complaints against Diane were marked addressed in the system. What Sarah discovered when she tried to access the security portal the next day was that her access had been revoked. She tried logging in with her credentials and got an error message. Your access privileges have been suspended pending security review. She called the HOA office immediately. Your access to the resident portal has been temporarily restricted, Patricia said, in that perfectly professional voice that suggested something terrible underneath. We're conducting a review of our security procedures. You'll be notified when the review is complete. Why, Sarah demanded. What did I do? That's something we'll discuss during the review, Patricia said. You'll receive written communication about the timeline. Sarah hung up feeling like the floor had dropped. The written communication arrived 4 days later. It was a letter from the HOA board, officially notifying Sarah that her unsupervised access to security footage had been found to exceed community guidelines. While her original complaints had been valid, the breadth of her investigation into another resident's activities was deemed to represent a potential privacy violation. Going forward, all requests for security footage would need to be submitted through the formal complaint process and approved by the board. The letter did not apologize. The letter did not justify. The letter simply informed her that the rules which she had been so invested in protecting had now been applied to her. Sarah read it 3 times, trying to find some error in it that would make it feel less devastating. There wasn't one. The HOA had simply decided that her behavior, while technically within the letter of the law, had violated its spirit. They were using her own weapon against her. 3 weeks later, something neither of them expected happened. The police arrived at Sarah Chen's apartment. A detective named Morrison knocked on her door at 8 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, presenting a warrant. He looked tired, the way police get tired when they're enforcing laws they don't particularly want to be enforcing. We need to talk about the towing incident from last month, he said. Sarah, standing in her doorway in yoga pants and a tank top, felt her stomach drop. What? The Range Rover, he said. Registered to Diane Thornton. You filed a complaint that resulted in that vehicle being towed. According to Ms. Thornton's statement, she was in the community as an approved guest at the time. No, Sarah said. She was there illegally, I documented. Ms. Thornton has information suggesting that you may have misrepresented facts in your complaint in order to trigger the towing, the detective said. Specifically, she's alleging that you knew she was an approved guest and filed the complaint anyway. That's potential filing a false report, or depending on how the prosecutor wants to pursue it, potentially harassment or malicious prosecution. Sarah's mouth opened and closed. That's not, I reported a violation that actually occurred. The vehicle was parked in a residence spot at 11:23 p.m., the detective agreed. But the question becomes, were you authorized to file complaints based on security footage you may have accessed inappropriately? That's what the HOA is telling us. They say you had unusual access to security systems and used that access to monitor a specific resident. I was concerned about community standards, Sarah said. I understand, the detective said. He sounded like he actually did understand, which was somehow worse. But here's what also concerns me. Diane Thornton is not pressing charges. She's not pursuing legal action. What she is doing is asking that we investigate whether there was malicious intent behind your reporting. And from where I sit, based on the HOA's account and the documentation they provided, the timeline is consistent with her allegation. This is insane, Sarah said. Maybe, the detective agreed. But it's worth clearing up. I need you to come down to the station and make a formal statement. You can bring a lawyer if you want. Sarah did bring a lawyer, an employment attorney she'd used for a workplace dispute 3 years ago. They sat in a small interview room at the police station for 3 hours while Sarah explained her actions, her reasoning, her documentation, her concern for community standards. The lawyer, a woman named Juliana who'd successfully defended Sarah during the workplace incident, took notes and occasionally intervened. My client followed all HOA procedures, Juliana said. She filed formal complaints. She was acting within her rights as a resident. She may have also been acting with malicious intent, the detective said mildly. That's what we're trying to determine, whether she filed complaints that were factually accurate but motivated by a desire to harm another resident. Motivation isn't illegal, Juliana said. Malicious prosecution is, the detective countered. Filing a report knowing it's false or with the intent to cause harm, that's different than filing a report with questionable motivation. But the HOA has made claims about her access to security footage. That's unusual. That suggests she may have gone beyond what a normal resident would do. The interview ended without conclusion. The detective said they'd be in touch. Sarah left the police station with her lawyer, who assured her that this was likely just an investigation and didn't necessarily mean anything would come of it. But Sarah could feel the shift. The weight had reversed. Now she was the one being investigated. Now she was the one with something to lose. What Diane hadn't told Sarah, what Diane had told only to the police and the HOA's legal counsel, was that she hadn't actually planned to press charges. She'd wanted Sarah to feel what it felt like to have the system pointed at you. She'd wanted Sarah to understand that when you open doors by leveraging procedure and documentation, those doors can be opened at you. Diane had filed a complaint with the police department, made her allegations, provided documentation. Then she'd requested that the investigation proceed, but that she not be involved in prosecution decisions. The police would investigate because a complaint had been made, but Diane wouldn't be pushing to press charges. It was a perfect attack. Sarah faced consequence for her actions, but Diane had maintained plausible deniability about malice. The HOA board, meanwhile, was having serious discussions about their own liability. Patricia had reviewed the security protocols carefully and determined that, yes, Sarah Chen had received access to information that should have been restricted. But Patricia had also granted that access, which meant Patricia had a responsibility in the situation. The board voted to limit all resident access to security information. Patricia was kept on for administrative purposes, but was no longer allowed to make unilateral decisions about HOA resource access. More significantly, the board voted on the community pool and parking policies themselves and determined they needed revision. The pool access for guests was clarified. The parking protocols were simplified. Everything was made more explicit, less subject to interpretation. Which meant that what had been gray areas, the spaces where people could negotiate and push and test boundaries, had now been painted in clear lines. Everyone lost something in this revision, but they all gained clarity. Sarah's formal statement to police resulted in no charges being filed. The detective determined that while her motivation had been questionable and her access to security information inappropriate, she hadn't technically violated any laws. She'd reported something that had violated policy. That the report had possibly been motivated by conflict didn't, in itself, constitute a crime. But the case remained open. The detective noted it in his files. Sarah would forever have a police investigation notation associated with her name. She would never know that Diane had asked the detective, quietly and off the record, to make sure it stayed open. Diane had suggested that Sarah should experience the lingering uncertainty of being investigated, the way you can't quite know if they're going to come back with charges, the way you have to think about it every time your phone rings. Diane had learned from Sarah that small, persistent consequences could be more effective than dramatic confrontations. The board meeting 6 weeks later was almost completely empty. The quarterly business had been handled. The new policies were in place. There was nothing to discuss except the quiet knowledge that something fundamental had shifted in this community. Sarah attended briefly to observe. She didn't speak. She just sat in the back and watched Patricia present the new security protocols and the updated guest policies and the clarified parking procedures. Diane did not attend. Neither of them had won. They'd both lost. Diane had won a temporary battle but had sacrificed something of herself in doing it. The clean feeling of simple victimhood had been complicated by the knowledge that she'd weaponized bureaucracy with malice aforethought. Sarah had lost access to the tools she'd been using to enforce standards, had experienced investigation, had been reminded that power is fragile. The community had gained clarity and lost trust. Everyone was now on notice that violations would be documented, that procedures had teeth, that the seemingly arbitrary rules were actually being watched and enforced. Everyone had gotten exactly what they'd said they wanted. Autumn came to Riverside Estates with the quiet inevitability that it comes to everywhere else. The leaves turned gold and then brown. The pool was maintained, but no longer had the constant press of summer visitors. The golf course turned dry in the heat of September, then green again in October when the fall rains came. Sarah stopped coming to the pool. She'd never formally quit. She just began her exercise routine in the mornings before the community center opened, alone in her apartment, using the expensive home gym equipment she ordered online. She attended fewer community events. She became the kind of resident who followed all the rules but wasn't actually present. Diane still visited. She and Andrea had established a Wednesday evening protocol after work but before dinner. The children would swim while the sisters sat by the pool and talked. It was peaceful, but it was also tinged with something. Neither of them fully relaxed. Neither Diane nor Sarah ever publicly acknowledged what had happened. They never spoke directly. They saw each other twice, once in the parking lot, where they both got into their cars and pretended the other wasn't there, and once at a community event where they were in the same room and both left within minutes of arriving. But the community knew. Everyone knew. The story spread in the careful way that these things spread, not through gossip but through the accumulated fact of observation. Sarah had reported Diane. Diane had had Sarah investigated. The police had gotten involved. The HOA had revised all the policies. It became the cautionary tale that circulated quietly. The thing that made people think twice before pushing too hard on their neighbors' behavior. The thing that made people realize that enforcement had costs. 4 months after the board meeting, Sarah did something she hadn't planned. She requested an appointment with Patricia. "I'd like to propose an amendment to the guest policies," Sarah said. They were sitting in Patricia's office, which was professional but not cold. She was better at this after the situation had settled. Patricia, immediately cautious, listened. "I think," Sarah said slowly, carefully, "that we should implement a formal amnesty period for past violations if people submit to the current guidelines going forward. No retroactive enforcement, no pending investigations, just reset and start clean." Patricia was quiet. "I think," Sarah continued, "that we're better as a community if we don't weaponize the rules. I think I got lost in enforcement and forgot that I was supposed to care about community." She said it formally, like she was reading from a document, because part of her was still controlled by procedure. But underneath it, there was something else, something like remorse or at least like recognition. "That's a generous proposal," Patricia said. I benefited from having someone care too much about rules, Sarah said. I don't think I thought about what that meant. Patricia took the proposal to the board. The board voted. The amnesty period was established for the previous 3 months, covering all violations that hadn't resulted in formal charges or towing. It applied to everyone equally. The written notice about the amnesty was sent to all residents. Diane read it at her apartment in Sacramento on a Thursday morning and understood what it meant. Sarah had, in her own way, called for a truce. What Diane did in response was surprising, even to herself. She submitted a formal request to the HOA for reconsideration of the towing fees. She provided documentation that she'd since adhered to all policies, that she'd successfully completed the guest approval process, and that she was requesting the fees be returned or credited to the community. The violation for which the fees were assessed has been addressed, she wrote. I would appreciate the opportunity for the community to reflect that in its records. Patricia presented this request to the board. The board voted to refund the towing fees as a gesture of community reconciliation, consistent with the amnesty period they'd just established. Diane received a check for $510 days later. The day Diane saw Sarah at the pool again was a Wednesday in November, almost a year to the day from when Diane had first arrived at Riverside Estates and begun using the facilities she had no right to use. Diane was sitting in a lounger, reading while the kids were in the water. Sarah emerged from the pool complex in a swimsuit, clearly having been swimming. Sarah didn't see Diane at first. She began her lap of the pool, moving through the water with the controlled precision of someone who swims regularly, someone who has invested in her body's fitness. Diane watched her move through the water, watched the muscle control, the breathing rhythm, the way Sarah had made this beautiful facility a central part of her routine. When Sarah finished her lap and climbed out, dripping and breathing hard from exertion, she saw Diane. For a moment, they just looked at each other across the space of a few loungers. Then Sarah did something that required significantly more courage than Sarah usually possessed. She walked over. Hi, she said, still breathing hard from swimming. Hi, Diane said back. I'm glad you can visit, Sarah said. I'm glad you got your fees refunded. I'm sorry I used your pool without paying, Diane said. I'm sorry I didn't just ask for permission from the beginning. I'm sorry I reported it to the police, Sarah said. I'm sorry I made it into something larger than it needed to be. They stood in the warm afternoon sun with chlorine and complexity between them. Neither of them had fully forgiven the other. Neither of them fully understood the other. But they'd both learned something about power, consequence, and the cost of enforcement. Did you know that the HOA had to update all the policies because of what happened? Sarah said. I didn't know that specifically, Diane said. They simplified the guest policy. They clarified the parking. They made it harder for residents to have informal access to security information, Sarah said. Because we both pushed too hard, everyone had to change how they operate. Is that bad? Diane asked. I don't know, Sarah said. It's more fair, I think, but it's also less flexible. There's less room for people to negotiate exceptions. Diane thought about this. Maybe that's better. Maybe, Sarah agreed. Sarah picked up her towel and began drying off. The kids can come every Wednesday if you want. I added my name to the community pool scheduling system as a potential swim partner for families. It's something they're starting to offer, supervised group swims. You don't have to do that, Diane said. I know, Sarah said, but I think I want to. She walked away then, back toward the changing rooms, leaving Diane with the understanding that sometimes resolution doesn't mean friendship. Sometimes it means just existing in the same space without damage. 6 months later, the Riverside Estates community held its annual meeting. Both Sarah and Diane attended, though they didn't sit together. The new policies were reviewed. The amended guest procedure was working well. The parking situation had normalized. The pool saw steady, regulated traffic from residents and approved guests. Patricia announced her retirement at the meeting. She decided property management wasn't for her anymore. She was going to try something else. Something, she said, that didn't involve enforcing rules for a living. The board hired a new manager who was younger, less attached to enforcement and more attached to mediation. The tone of the community began to shift, slowly, toward something less adversarial. Diane and Sarah never became friends. They never had coffee together or socialized beyond the occasional pool conversation. They never fully resolved the complexity of what had happened between them. But they learned to coexist. They learned that there were costs to enforcement. They learned that the other person had legitimate motivations, even when those motivations had been in direct opposition. They learned that victory can be hollow and that the best outcomes often feel not triumphant but simply concluded. And the community, which had almost destroyed itself in the conflict between one woman's need to enforce rules and another woman's need to find freedom in those rules, slowly became gentler. Not because enforcement was gone, but because everyone now understood what enforcement looked like when you pushed hard enough. Everyone understood the price. And in that understanding, they found their way to something approaching peace.